Hey everyone. Welcome back to Hoa Karen Stories. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the latest drama. In today's story, I'm taking you through a wild battle with my tyrannical Hoa president, Karen. After she tries to bully me into submission, I decide to take matters into my own hands and build a medieval-style drawbridge to protect my property. But Karen doesn't back down that easily. Tune in to hear how this epic clash ends and how the neighborhood finally breaks free from her reign of terror. Grab some popcorn, and let's get into it. It was an unusually quiet morning when I first heard it, a high-pitched voice screaming in the distance. The kind of scream that could only come from Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our Hoa. I had just stepped out of my house, coffee in hand, ready to enjoy some peace when I saw her standing at the edge of my property. Her eyes were wide, her face flushed with anger, and her arms were crossed tightly across her chest. Her brand-new luxury SUV was parked directly in front of my driveway, blocking me from leaving. "Morning, Karen," I called out, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the storm brewing in my chest. "Your car's blocking my driveway." Her lips twisted into that smug, self-righteous grin I knew so well. "Oh, I know," she replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "But it's for your own good. We've had several complaints about your driveway." I paused, the confusion clear on my face. "Complaints? From who?" "That's confidential." She waved her hand dismissively. "But the Hoa decided that your driveway doesn't comply with community standards. I'll be parking here until it's addressed." I couldn't believe it. "Are you seriously telling me that you're parking in front of my driveway because of some vague complaints?" Karen's smile only grew wider. "Yes. And if you tried to tow my car, I'll have to file a harassment complaint with the Hoa. You've been warned." I stood there, jaw clenched, trying not to lose my temper. I knew she was trying to provoke me, trying to make me act out so she could use it against me. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked back inside, my mind already racing with ideas for what I could do next. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After days of Karen's persistent harassment, I reached a boiling point. Every morning, her SUV was still parked in front of my driveway, and every time I called the Hoa or tried to get it towed, I was met with more excuses and delays. The Hoa, of course, sided with her, and the fines kept piling up. The system was rigged, and it was clear Karen was using her power to make my life miserable. I knew something had to change, but I wasn't about to play by her rules anymore. So, I did what any fed-up homeowner would do. I turned to the law. I spent nights poring over property codes, zoning laws, and Hoa regulations. And after hours of research, I found it, a loophole that could turn the tables. According to local ordinances, there were no restrictions on creating temporary security structures as long as they didn't permanently alter the property. A grin spread across my face. This was the break I needed. The next morning, I was up before dawn, on the phone with contractors. I rented an excavator and hired a crew, giving them very specific instructions. I wanted a trench dug around my driveway, a massive, 4-foot-deep trench, wide enough to stop any car in its tracks. But I wasn't just stopping there. No, I had something even better planned. By the end of the day, the trench was done, and I had already started sketching out the design for my next project, a bridge. But not just any bridge, a medieval-style drawbridge that I could raise and lower at will. It would keep Karen and her SUV locked out, and it was totally within my rights to build it. The contractors looked at me like I had lost my mind, but I could see the excitement in their eyes. "You're serious about this, huh?" one of them asked as they packed up for the day. "Absolutely," I replied with a grin. "Let's just say Karen won't be parking here again." The day the drawbridge was completed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The solid wood planks were in place, the pulley system was working smoothly, and with a few quick tugs on the rope, the bridge would rise, blocking off my driveway completely. It wasn't just a security feature, it was a bold statement. Karen wasn't going to get away with her bullying anymore. The next morning, I stepped outside to admire the final result. But as soon as I opened the door, I saw her. Karen was standing on the sidewalk. Her face twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. Her arms flailing dramatically as she pointed at my bridge. "This is ridiculous," she screamed, hands on her hips. "You can't just put a bridge in the middle of the neighborhood." I leaned against the doorframe, enjoying the moment. "Actually, I can. The Hoa rules encourage security improvements. And this is temporary. Totally within the guidelines." She narrowed her eyes, fists clenched in frustration. "You're breaking the law. This is a safety hazard. And I'm going to make sure it's removed. Right now." I raised an eyebrow. "You know, you're welcome to try. But everything here is legally sound. I filed the proper permits. And the city signed off on it." Karen's face flushed, and her voice dropped an octave, turning colder. "I'll have the city inspectors here. And you'll see. They'll shut you down." I shrugged, trying to keep my calm. "You go ahead, Karen. You won't find anything wrong." I made sure of that. True to her word. Later that afternoon, Karen called in the city inspectors. I watched from my window as they arrived. A small group of them in official uniforms, walking toward my driveway, clipboard in hand. Karen was with them, no doubt attempting to convince them that I was breaking every rule in the book. After a thorough inspection, the inspectors stood around, conferring for a moment before nodding at each other. They turned to Karen. "We've checked the property, and everything appears to be in order," one of the inspectors said, his voice flat. "This structure is temporary and complies with all local regulations. There's nothing here that violates any codes." Karen's face went pale. "What?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. This can't be happening." "Ma'am," another inspector added, "you might want to review the rules before making accusations. This is perfectly legal." Karen's entire body stiffened, and she turned on her heel, storming off without another word. Watching her retreat, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. For once, Karen had met her match. After the failure of her attempt to have the drawbridge removed, Karen's fury reached new heights. She spent the next few days pacing around her house, plotting her next move. I knew she wouldn't back down easily. Karen never did. Sure enough, an urgent notice from the Hoa appeared in my mailbox the following week, announcing an emergency meeting to address an urgent violation of community standards. I rolled my eyes as I read the letter. I knew exactly what this was about. Karen had clearly failed in her attempt to get the city inspectors to shut me down. And now she was turning to the Hoa to try and force me into compliance. I had no doubt she thought this meeting would give her the upper hand. But she couldn't have been more wrong. The night of the meeting, I walked into the small community hall, the air tense with anticipation. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, her expression triumphant. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes narrowing. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," she sneered. "We're here to discuss your unsightly bridge." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Unsightly? I thought you said it was a safety hazard." Karen didn't even blink. "This structure violates our community's aesthetic standards. The Hoa must take action to remove it immediately." I could see her expecting the board to back her up, as they always had in the past. But as I scanned the room, I noticed something different. Several board members, the ones who had once been too afraid to speak up against her, were now exchanging glances. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the members, a middle-aged man who had been quiet for years, finally spoke up. "Karen, we've all had enough of the way you've been running this Hoa. It's time to let people live in peace." Karen's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean? I'm just trying to maintain order here." "No," he shot back. "You've been bullying people for far too long. This bridge is within the rules. And frankly, we're tired of your constant meddling." A murmur of agreement spread across the room. Another member chimed in. "We've been watching you, Karen. You've been making everyone's life miserable with your petty rules. Maybe it's time for you to step down." Karen's face turned crimson. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She hadn't expected this level of rebellion. The board members, once too afraid to challenge her, were now standing up for what was right. The meeting went silent for a moment before one more person spoke. "I don't think we need to remove the bridge. In fact, I think we should vote on dissolving the Hoa altogether." The suggestion was met with a collective gasp. But for once, it wasn't just Karen's supporters who reacted. The rest of the board members nodded in agreement. Karen was completely blindsided. She sputtered, trying to regain control. But the momentum had shifted, and it was clear that her reign was coming to an end. By the end of the meeting, she had lost any remaining support. The motion to remove her from her position as Hoa president passed with overwhelming support. The atmosphere in the Hoa meeting was tense. Karen had just lost the support of the board members, and her usual confidence seemed to evaporate as she realized the tide had turned against her. However, I wasn't finished yet. I had one final ace up my sleeve: documents that would expose Karen's long history of abusing her position as Hoa president. As the room quieted, I stood up and opened a folder I had prepared. The papers inside were damning: records of her fraudulent fines, misuse of Hoa funds, and instances where she had targeted certain homeowners unfairly, all in the name of maintaining control. I laid the documents out on the table, one by one. As the board members leaned in to read, I could see the shock on their faces as the truth began to sink in. "These are just a few examples," I said, my voice steady. "Karen has been using her position to manipulate Hoa funds for personal gain. She's been fining people who don't comply with her every whim, even when there's no legal basis for it. And if you look closely, you'll see that some of those fines have been funneled into her own accounts." The room was silent, the weight of the evidence palpable. One board member, the same one who had spoken out earlier, looked up at Karen, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Karen, how could you? We trusted you with this responsibility." Karen's face turned an ashen color, her hands trembling as she looked from the documents to the board members. "This is all lies. You don't know what you're talking about," she sputtered. Her usual confidence shattered. But the facts were undeniable. The more the board members reviewed the documents, the clearer it became. Karen had been running a fraudulent operation, funneling money from the Hoa into personal accounts, using intimidation and manipulation to maintain her power. Minutes later, Karen was forced to resign from her position as Hoa president. Her reign of control had come to a crushing end, and the investigation into her misconduct began almost immediately. As news of her actions spread throughout the neighborhood, people began to see her for what she truly was: a fraud who had abused her power for personal gain. The fallout was swift. The Hoa, now free of Karen's corrupt leadership, began taking steps to ensure such abuse would never happen again. The board members who had been too afraid to speak out now realized the extent of her deceit, and they pledged to rebuild the Hoa on a foundation of trust and transparency. The final chapter of Karen's reign of terror came swiftly after her resignation. The investigation into her financial misconduct grew more intense as authorities began to piece together the full extent of her corruption. It wasn't long before she was forced to leave the neighborhood altogether. Her once towering presence reduced to nothing more than a shadow. The house she had once held in such high regard sat on the market for weeks, its value plummeting as people became aware of her fraudulent activities. No one wanted to live in a house once owned by the tyrant of Crestwood. With Karen gone, the Hoa was officially dissolved. The once feared organization that had brought so much grief to the neighborhood was no more. A new sense of freedom swept through the community. No more fines for ridiculous infractions. No more watching over your shoulder in fear of a random visit from Karen. People could finally breathe easy. As for me, I became something of a local hero. My drawbridge, once considered a ridiculous act of defiance, had become a symbol of resistance against unjust authority. Children would come by, laughing and asking to see the drawbridge in action. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved and congratulated me on standing up for what was right. The trench, though still deep and wide, no longer seemed like an obstacle. It was a monument to the fight for justice. One evening, as I stood on my driveway grilling steaks, an older neighbor who had lived in the area for decades stopped by. He watched as the sun set over the now peaceful neighborhood, the sound of laughter and music drifting through the air from nearby houses. "You know," he said with a grin, "I always thought someone would take Karen down eventually. But I never imagined it would happen with a trench and a bridge." I chuckled, flipping the steaks. "Sometimes you have to get creative." He nodded, looking around at the neighborhood, which now felt more relaxed, more open. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. This place is better without her." And it was. For the first time since I had moved in, the neighborhood felt like a community again, united and free from the oppressive rules Karen had imposed on everyone. We no longer lived in fear of her fines or arbitrary rules. Now, there was peace. The drawbridge remained standing as a reminder that sometimes, standing up for what's right takes more than words, it takes action. As I sipped my drink, I raised a quiet toast to the newfound freedom, knowing that with Karen gone, the neighborhood had finally returned to the way it was meant to be, a place of harmony.